If 1979 was the year of great humanitarian endeavors in Iowa, 1980 was the year of incredible political transformation. And once again, being in Iowa on loan from the State Department to the office of Governor Robert Ray, I had a front seat at these amazing stories played out. The caucuses were in late January that year. And I remember going out on this freezing cold night to go up to Merrill School, where the caucuses in my precinct were being held, and to watch. The Republicans were in the auditorium, very orderly, following Robert's rules of procedure, and filling out and writing the names of the different Republican candidates on pieces of paper. And the Democrats were in the gym, and as a whistle is blown, running and forming groups, and then seeing who's got how many, and people running between groups. It was impossible to understand unless you knew all the rules about what was happening. And I thought if somebody showed up from a foreign country and said, "Is this how you pick the president of the United States, with people running around forming groups?" But it's such an powerful experience, because here people in my neighborhood, my neighbors, all going out, feeling we have a real hand. What's happening tonight in choosing who's going to be the candidates for president and who's going to be the president. So it's wonderful, inspiring grassroots experience. And that night, in both Republican and Democratic caucus, there were two political dynasties, American political dynasties, being impacted. In the Democratic race, Senator Ted Kennedy was challenging President Jimmy Carter, the sitting president of the United States. Ted Kennedy was endeavoring to bring back Camelot, to bring back the legacy of his two brothers, both of whom had been assassinated in the 1960s, to reclaim that Kennedy majesty and Kennedy magic. And that night in Iowa, Democrats formed bigger groups in the caucuses for President Carter, then for Senator Kennedy, who no doubt was impacted by the events at Chappaquiddick, which had happened not that long ago. And they gave President Carter a resounding victory, which in fact brought to an end the Kennedy dynasty in American politics. And in the other part of the school, where the Republicans were voting, and they had a really interesting and broad array of candidates. Ronald Reagan, the governor of California, was seen as the clear frontrunner. Challengers included Senate Majority Leader Howard Baker, Governor John Connally from Texas, who had been in the car when Kennedy was assassinated, wounded himself when President John Kennedy was assassinated, conservative Phil Crane, liberal Republican Congressman John Anderson, who appealed to a number of moderate Republicans, and George Herbert Walker Bush, the head of the U.S. liaison office in China, head of the CIA, who was now endeavoring to challenge President Reagan, along with all these other Republican leaders. Bush was not as well known as Connally or Baker, but he came and he worked so hard. I remember seeing Bush 41 out on my block in my neighborhood several times, and he showed up at the school to ask for votes, candidates standing on the stage saying, "Vote for me for president." And that night, on that cold, freezing January night of 1980, about 1,000 more Republicans voted for George Bush than for Ronald Reagan. It was like a political earthquake. Everyone had expected Reagan was going to clear the field. He, in fact, had, at the advice of his campaign manager, John Sears, who was subsequently fired, skipped the Des Moines Register debate, sent the message, oh, I don't need to be there and answer questions in front of the people of Iowa. It was a big mistake. Suddenly, it became a two-man race between Reagan and Bush. Of course, subsequently, Reagan recovered, won the New Hampshire primary, went on to secure the Republican nomination, and yet then turned to unite the party, turned to George Bush to be his vice presidential running mate. Without that victory in the Iowa caucuses, certainly Bush probably would have been an afterthought and never chosen to be the vice president. After 8 years of serving as vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush ran for president himself in 1988 and was elected president. And his two sons, George W. Bush and Jeb Bush, were launched on their own political campaigns. And I think it's very arguable that without their father being vice president and president, they might not ever have achieved the role of governor of Texas or governor of Florida. And it's just as arguable that George W. Bush, the 43rd president of the United States, would not have been the candidate for president or elected president except for those 1,000 Iowa Republican caucus goers who braved that winter freezing night to go out to their school or wherever their caucus was held and give George Herbert Walker Bush that slim victory. And so as the Kennedy dynasty was coming to an end, the Bush dynasty was beginning, all at the Iowa caucuses. And once again, there I was in the front row watching history being made. There are other stories from that year, but that central one was amazing to be able to witness and see American democracy at work.